Hey guys, in this video I'm going to perform a mechanical explanation video that will touch on the hips and pelvis rotating into front foot strike. This mechanic is extremely critical for athletes looking to maximize their hip-shoulder separation at front foot strike. So if you're an athlete looking to achieve more hip-shoulder separation, make sure you pay attention to some of the key tips I give you during this mechanical explanation. All right guys, so here I have Marcus Stroman and we're going to do a mechanical explanation breakdown today of Marcus here, and we're going to take a look at some of the key concepts when it relates to opening or essentially rotationally opening the hips and pelvis into front foot strike and getting the hips and pelvis cleared into front foot strike and kind of what that means. So let's go ahead and get Marcus. We're going to pause him here in the linear drive phase. So we'll get him to about right in here. And this is kind of where it all starts. So a couple things I want to touch on before we even get into the hip and pelvic rotation portion is some setup things, some kind of housekeeping items that we got to verify that are occurring before we get into the hips and pelvic rotation into front foot strike. Reason being is if we want to maximize that rotational move with the lower half, we got to do some things up front that ultimately will kind of set us up for success as we go into maximizing that rotational move. So first thing is the pelvis closed off? Is it in a coiled position? I touch on this. I have a whole video on the pelvic coil. I'll link it to this video. But ultimately, that's something that you're going to want to watch and ensure that your pelvis is closed off. Here we can see that Marcus's pelvis is closed off, meaning that it's in a coiled position, meaning that the belt buckle is closed off, pointed towards third base, and he's keeping that pelvic coil in order to maintain the rotational range of the pelvis throughout the linear drive phase. By maintaining that coiled up pelvis, and when I say coiled up pelvis, I'm talking about a pelvis that's coiled over the femur of the back leg. That's going to allow us to maximize the rotational range of the pelvis into front foot strike. It's also going to prevent us from leaking rotationally with the pelvis, where the pelvis starts to rotate prematurely during the linear drive phase, which is going to prevent us from ultimately cutting off some additional range into front foot strike. That's going to allow us to ultimately speed up that pelvis in a more efficient manner during our lower half rotational move. So again, pelvic coil is all about delaying pelvic rotation, keeping the pelvis in a coiled up position, and that's going to allow us to maximize that rotational move that we'll touch on here in a second. Second thing I like to touch on here is the lead foot positioning. This is kind of another housekeeping item that we need to verify before we go into hip and pelvic rotation. Where is his lead foot? Ideally, we want the lead foot on this side of the back foot. So if I were to draw a line here to the toe line of his back foot, we can clearly see that his lead foot is ultimately on the third base side of where his back foot is. And I'm going to get right into the hip and pelvic rotation portion of the video here. And we're going to take a look at how by him ultimately getting that lead foot there, it's going to allow him to utilize the lead leg pullback mechanical concept. That's going to ultimately allow him to initiate his pelvic and hip rotation with the lead leg and ultimately prompt that hip and pelvic rotation to occur. So let's go ahead and get into it. So those are two things that I look for ultimately before we even get to the hips and pelvis opening. So now let's go ahead and take a look at what happens here, what kind of prompts the hips and pelvis to open. So let's draw a line here at the front of Marcus's foot. We can see that it's way out here. What we're going to see is now in the next couple of frames, this foot is going to begin pulling back into front foot strike. And when I say pulling back, pulling essentially this way towards the first base side. So let's go ahead and watch that move. There you can see it all occurring, right? As that's occurring, notice what's happening with the pelvis. So as we get him to here, right, his pelvis is pointed this direction. Now focus in here on what is happening with that pelvis. What do we see happening? As the foot pulls back, the pelvis is opening into front foot strike, right? So I would say that's about front foot strike. And now we see that his pelvis is pointed pretty much in alignment with the batter. It's probably at about a 70-degree range, which I'll touch on here in a second. But ultimately, that lead foot and that lead leg performing that pullback move that it did, as we see here, ultimately is prompting the hips and pelvis to rotate. So again, back to the setup thing, we want that lead foot out front of the back foot and ultimately so that we can initiate pelvic and hip rotation and we can prompt the hips and pelvis to rotate by pulling back the lead foot. That is so critical and not enough people talk about it. If you get your lead foot set up right there like his is, he's allowing himself to pull that lead foot backwards, which is going to prompt the hips and pelvis to open in an explosive manner and rotate quickly and super fast into front foot strike. So we want to make sure that we're accomplishing that. And that's ultimately kind of the first move into getting the hips and pelvis open is the lead leg pullback. And that's ultimately what we just covered. So now let's simply just focus in here on the hips and pelvis. That's ultimately what this video is about. What are we looking for here? We're looking for the hips and pelvis to get rotated into a 45 to 90 degree range into front foot strike. Now what is 45 to 90 degree range? 45 to 90, so ultimately 0 degrees would be a pelvis, a belt buckle. When I say pelvis, think about the belt buckle and where it's facing. That is pointed directly over here towards the third base dugout. That would be 0 degrees of pelvic rotation into front foot strike. 90 degrees would be a belt buckle that's pointed directly at the throwing target. So that would be directly, ultimately at the catcher's glove or at home plate, right? So we'll say that that's 90 degrees. 45 degrees is going to be obviously right in between that, so somewhere in there. That's what we call 45 degrees. What we're looking for in your mechanical evaluation is that you ultimately are in this range, right? We can see Marcus is within that range. Marcus, if I had to bet, is between probably 60 to 70 degrees of pelvic rotation. That's optimal. Again, anywhere between 45 and 90 is kind of what we see. Shohei Ohtani is a good example of a guy that only gets about 45 degrees of pelvic rotation. Obviously, he throws 100 miles an hour. Now, I'm not going to say that that's the only reason he throws 100 miles an hour. He throws 100 miles an hour for a lot of other reasons. But then Dylan Cease would be an example. I'll put him up on your screen of a guy that gets almost to about 90 degrees of pelvic rotation, meaning that his belt buckle is pointed directly at the target. So ultimately, to recap, what are we looking for in this mechanic? We're looking for our players to be between that to that 45 to 90 degree range. So we want them to ultimately be rotated into front foot strike with the hips and pelvis and allowing them to clear into front foot strike. What that's going to set us up for is that's going to set us up with the lower half to be in a position to where we can achieve hip shoulder separation. Now there's things that got to happen above that, right, with the upper half. The upper half has to stay back, but ultimately our number one job with our lower half is to get those hips and pelvis to clear into front foot strike, and that's going to set us up in a very good position for us to disassociate the lower and upper half into front foot strike. So one thing I want to touch on that's kind of a telltale sign of a guy that is very good and that is efficient at rotating into front foot strike with the hips and pelvis is that the back leg internally rotates. And we'll kind of touch on what that means here, but ultimately what we're looking for is we're looking for the back leg to internally rotate, and what's going to happen as a result of that is we're going to see the foot go from a flat position. So here we can see Marcus's back foot is ultimately flat there, right? It's essentially even against the rubber. So what we're going to want to see is we're going to want to see this heel begin to come off of the ground and end up in a vertical position to where his heel is going to be pointed up towards the sky. That's what tells me that a person is correctly and efficiently utilizing their hips and pelvis to rotate into front foot strike. So with that being said, let's see if Marcus is able to achieve that. Let's see if he is efficient with rotating his hips and pelvis. So what do we see here? We start to see as we begin to initiate hip and pelvic rotation with the lead leg, we see Marcus's heel coming up, right? You see that? So now into front foot strike, where is his heel? His heel is pointed, if we were to draw a line through his toe, through his heel, it's pointed that way, right? It's pointed up towards the sky. That is a result of back leg internal rotation. So let's keep an eye on what his back leg's doing here. So his knee ultimately is pointed which direction here? It's pointed off over there, right? Now watch his knee is going to now begin to rotate down and in, and that's what ultimately back leg internal rotation is. If Marcus is utilizing his hips and pelvis correctly and he's rotating into front foot strike, that heel of that back foot is naturally going to rip off the ground, and that back leg's going to internally rotate and ultimately essentially cause that back heel to end up in that vertical position that I just showed you. So let's go ahead and move them through here. There we see the back leg internally rotating. You see that move? and then boom, into front foot strike. Now we got that vertical heel position where the back foot is pointed up to the sky, and boom. There we can see that Marcus has done a great job at being efficient with rotating the hips and pelvis. So that's just kind of a checkpoint I utilize to see how well our athletes are utilizing, or essentially how efficiently they're utilizing the hips and pelvis in the front foot strike. If we see that back leg internally rotating, we see that heel up to the sky, then I know that they're probably doing a great job there, and their hip and pelvic rotational move is very efficient. And that's ultimately what we're looking for in order to maximize hip-shoulder separation. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I hope you found it useful. Please hit the subscribe button if you want to see more mechanical explanations like this. And thank you guys for watching as always, and we look forward to catching you in the next video. Thanks.